Poetics of Exile by Dr. Henri Oripeloye of Obafemi Awolowo University. Dr. Oripeloye, good to see you. You're muted.
Yes. Okay, Tosin, thank you very much. How are you doing?
Very well, sir. Good to see you.
How are you doing?
Surviving.
You look more than somebody surviving. The way I look at you. And then, how are you doing? Yeah, welcome. Thank you very much. Gabriel, this face is familiar. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So good to see everyone. Good to see Dr. Satsima, Dr. Bangboshi, Dr. Anyaduba, a very good friend, Razak Malik. So we're going to start right away. And the first person to present is Dr. Anyaduba. And Dr. Anyaduba is an assistant professor of English at the University of Winnipeg, Canada. His teaching and research interests focus broadly on African literatures. His current scholarship explores cultural representations of genocides and mass atrocities in Africa. Arthur is the author of the book monograph, The Post-Colonial African Genocide, Quest for Meaningfulness. I don't know why I always like to say meaninglessness, but I don't know, but meaningfulness, published by Liverpool University Press. Welcome, Arthur, to our presentations.
Yeah, thanks, Destin. I guess that's actually the impulse behind the writing of the book, that it's Quest for Meaninglessness, but somehow the reviewers changed the title for me. Anyway, thanks a lot for inviting me to be on this panel. I don't have words enough to thank Professor Oripeloye for gifting us with this wonderful work, and also to Saeed for putting together this huge, monumental, successful conference. Yeah, maybe what I think I want to do is to provide my own reading of the work and just highlight very few things that I think stand out significantly for me in this book. So Henri Oripeloye's book, Poetics of Exile, a reading of 5 Anglophone West African poets, provides incisive discussion of selected poetry collections in English by 5 West African poets, including Sierra Leonean Siucheni Kupa's Concerto for an Exile, Ghanaian Abenabusia's Testimonies of Exile, and the works of 3 Nigerian poets, Odiofe Imon's London Letters and Other Poems, Taniro Jaide's When It No Longer Matters, Where You Live, and Femi Odrade's Exile at Home. Oripeloye reads these works as espousing what he calls poetics of exile. And according to the author, African poetry of exile originated in the slavery experience, and this form of poetry has continued to shape Africa's humanistic expressions against what he described as the nightmarish conditions that characterized African realities. So Poetics of Exile, I think I broadly divided it into 2 parts that are spread across 7 main chapters, excluding the conclusion of the work. The first part of the book comprises the first 3 chapters of the book for me. And these chapters provide contextual discussions of the concepts and approaches used by the author to read the selected poetry. These chapters make a strong case for recognizing exile as a framework for reading African poetry. And Oripeloye argues that we must see exile as an interpretive framework for reading African literature more broadly, because the thematic of exile is prevalent in African poetic imagination, and I agree. But what exactly is this exile that African writers seem to be obsessed with? For Oripeloye, exile is indicative of a forceful, and I'm quoting the book now, forceful separation from home, end of quote. This idea of exile, according to the author, is ancient, if not universal. And Oripeloye traces this idea to the biblical imaginary of exile in the banishment of Adam and Eve from Eden, for example. And in the biblical imaginary, the exiled man or woman becomes, to quote from the book, an outcast, a wanderer, and a drifter, end of quote. It is this idea of exile as alienation or estrangement from home that Oripeloye depicts in the selected works discussed in the book as offering some kind of profound statements on African predicaments. So the histories of slavery on the continent, colonization, and post-colonial forms of violence underscore, according to Oripeloye, the conditions of exile in Africa. The second part of the book, which comprises chapters 4 to 7, provides analysis of the selected poetry collections. The individual chapters each make a case for recognizing the selected works as exilic poetry with particularized poetics unique to each poet. For example, Oripeloye sees Chenikoka's Concerto for an Exile to be based on an autobiographical poetics that accounts for communal or collective experiences of exile through a biography of the self. In other words, the autobiography of the self becomes a way to write the biography of the collective. Similarly, according to Oripeloye, Abena Busia's Testimonies of Exile is underpinned by a testamentary poetics, which presents the personal or private experiences of an exiled female subject to testify to a people's exilic conditions. So in both of Chenikoka's and Busia's works, as Oripeloye argues, the poetic self in exile appears to be on a mission to return home by way of nostalgic reminiscences. Chapter 6, which discusses Ophemon's London letters and Ojaide's When It No Longer Matters, is a bit of an outlier for me because it departs from the theme of nostalgic returns and the mourning of lost home in the two previous chapters. Oripeloye discusses both works as attempts to rewrite, to quote from the work, the conventional exilic tropes in order to accommodate the dynamic character of new spatial relations. In other words, the author sees these works as guided by a poetics of relationality, whereby the boundaries between home and exile are blurred. The visions of home and exile in these works, according to Oripeloye, should be seen in relational terms. And the author goes on to read these works as poetry of cosmopolitanism that brings the speciality of home and exile in an interactional relationship. Yet I must point out, as I mentioned earlier, that this chapter is not exactly clear as offering a reading of exile. I think that the cosmopolitan vision of Ophemon's and Ojaide's works that Oripeloye described insightfully in this chapter derives from the author's application of theories of postmodernism and postcolonialism. But I thought that these frameworks work largely to distract from the focus on exile and offered instead an important insight into the realities of transnational consciousness and cosmopolitan ethics, but not so much on the analytics of exile. The 7th chapter of the book further complicates the conventional ideas of exile by focusing on the representation of what the author calls internal exile in Femi Ojoade's Exile at Home. Oripeloye provides an analysis, very incisive analysis of the book's representations of social ills, political failures and corruption, and the destruction of Nigerian environments as clear indications of the poet's vision of home as a place or site of exile. Ojoade's Poetics of Exile, therefore, is shown to derive from his social criticism of the political and social preconditions that have turned the national home into a site of exile. To my mind, the signal contribution of Oripeloye's Poetics of Exile is perhaps mostly felt in its forceful insistence that exile as thematic and analytic offers a viable framework for reading African writings, past and present. Yet, like any intellectual work of significance, Poetics of Exile offers some generative potential for quarrels and critical conversations. I quarreled with a few points in the book, but because of time, I will limit myself to only one that I think will help to complicate, but also drive an understanding of the book's argument further. So besides what I consider to be the book's problematic equation of home with the African nation state, my main quarrel with the book is its vision of exile. And the book's vision of exile, I think, derives from what I consider as an ontological notion of exile. And this ontology of exile can be gleaned from the first chapter of the book. And it presents a vision of exile as a rupturous process whereby the exiled person or self has been forcefully separated from a harmonious home. A separation that turns the exile into a wanderer of the world, in other words, an alien unto their authentic self. So this vision of exile came, as I suspect, on the author's reading, or rather reliance on the biblical Adamic story of exile as forceful separation from Eden. In part, a Judeo-Christian tale of the world as a place of exile and heaven as home. I think that this vision of exile may be effacing other possibilities of meaning that an African vision of exile may offer. And I want to give an example using Things Fall Apart that I think is very popular for most of us, most notably in Okonkwo's banishment from Umuofia, for example. So one may notice Okonkwo's exile clearly shows a man separated from his homeland. In other words, his compound and houses are razed and his family expelled for a period of time. In the place of exile, which incidentally is his motherland, Okonkwo's attitude is expectedly nostalgic and laden with all the romantic recollections of homely exploits and experiences. The vision of exile in Oripeloye's Poetics of Exile would encourage us to look at Okonkwo's banishment as a lamentable condition of alienation and estrangement from homeland, a process that turns this subject into some kind of ruthless wanderer. What this focus on Okonkwo's banishment may disguise is that the condition of exile here is in fact a reparative cleansing ritual. In other words, a process that is designed to allow for a reformative justice for manslaughter. My point precisely is that there are other ways in which we can understand and discuss exile in a West African context. So Poetics of Exile, I think, depended on an idea of exile that derived from Judeo-Christian visions of exile. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. It just doesn't appear to propel our understanding of exile beyond the established meanings in the dominant discourses. My sense is that a critical theorization of the concept of exile in the West African focus of the book might have offered more possibilities of meaning. And I know that the author mentioned the Yoruba idea of the world as a marketplace, except for me that this idea doesn't exactly suggest that a marketplace is a site of exile, at least in the Judeo-Christian notion of it. The traditional Yoruba market, as I understand it, is a transactional place of different activities where the fullness of life may be experienced, where the self finds full meaning based on the relationship it establishes with others. So it's not a place for banishment, nor does it uphold a Judeo-Christian vision of exile as a place of radical separation of the self from divine meaning. Yet my quarrel with the book's approach to exile attests to the generative potential of Poetics of Exile. The book is a crucial invitation for more critical conversations on a concept that holds enormous potential and possibilities for reading and apprehending African literatures past and present. Once again, I want to thank and congratulate Professor Oripeloye for gifting us with this incisive work and for the opportunity to think with his insights. Thanks, Oga.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayanduba. Thank you. So I'll move on to Dr. Bangbushe. Dr. Bangbushe is a Nigerian poet and literary critic. He's the founding editor of the Jargon Poetry Journal and the author of the poetry volume, Something Happened After the Rain. His academic articles have appeared in African Literature Today, African Symposium, and Comparative Literature and Culture. Welcome to our discussion, Dr. Bangbushe.
Thank you so much for the generous invitation. Let me begin by saying it's a great privilege to be among poetry gurus today. And I think we should have more of this kind of conversation. And I also want to say a very big thank you to LSA for opening up the space for this book conversation, and to sincerely appreciate the opportunity to join this conversation on Professor Henri Oripeloye's beautiful book, Poetics of Exile. It is indeed beautiful, right? And I appreciate the gift. So thank you, first of all, for writing this generous book. And I'm just going to point attention to the general framework of the work, and to some of my own musings about the work, which might not necessarily be a problematic you have to engage with. But it's just my own way of thinking about the ways in which the work might allow us to reread the canon of African poetry through the framework of exile, as Arthur has rightly noted earlier. Poetics of Exile revisit the literary construction of exilic consciousness in the writings of African poet intellectuals whose lives have been shaped by the experience of migration in one form or the other. And we have 5 poets here, Sio Chinekoka from Sierra Leone, Abena Busia from Ghana, and 3 Nigerian poets, Tanro Jaide, Odiofemon, and Femi Ojuade. Focusing on the poetic text this writer published between 1980 and year 2000, which is a very crucial moment in African history. It's a moment of diverse political and economic crisis in the spaces the writers are thinking from. For example, we can think of the SAP, the the structural adjustment policies, the IMF policies that led to economic disasters and migration of many people, including the intellectuals. And of course, also a moment of diverse dictatorial regimes in Africa. So the book asks, what does exile mean in the individual poet's imagination of the self, home, and the world? How do the meanings of exile in African poetic text challenge the homogeneous idea of exile? In what ways do the heterogeneous formation of exilic consciousness destabilize fixed ideas of cultural identity, belonging, and nationality? The book responds to these questions in 7 chapters. The first 3 chapters engage the theoretical discourse of exile in relation to the concept of migration, diaspora, cultural identity, and transnationalism. The remaining 4 chapters focus on the work of the 5 poets mentioned earlier by reading the figuration of alienation, dislocation, disorientation, displacement, memory, and nostalgia in their poetry. For me, the book makes 3 major interventions in the discourse of exile in African literary studies. First, it contributes to scholarship on exile, postcoloniality, globalization, and world literature through a serious engagement with African poetry. In the intellectual climate where the study of the novel dominates postcolonial studies, it is really exciting to read a whole book on African poetry. And I find it very intriguing that Oripeloye's work illuminates the centrality of poetry to the articulations of exile as a mode of consciousness, and, to quote Raymond Williams, a structure of feeling. In the reading of Chinekoka's Concerto for an Exile, published in 1980, or Jaide's When It No Longer Matters Where You Live, published in 1998, and of Femon's London Letters and Other Poems, published in 2000, for example, Oripeloye explores the social, economic, political, and cultural dynamics of internal and external exile, existential and symbolic exile, physical and psycho-spiritual exile. Second, the book troubles the geography of exile by paying careful attention to its formation, not only in the diaspora, but also within the nation state. While emphasizing the territorial imaginary of exile, the book interrogates the prevalence of territorial displacement and mobility in the idea of exile to articulate forms of exilic consciousness produced through social, political, and psychological immobility. I specifically find the reading of Ojuade's Exile at Home, published in 1992, intriguing because it describes a form of exile experienced within a nation state structured by military terror and quotidian violence. Third, the book resists, and this is my joy, the book resists the masculinist imagination of poetic knowledge. And as you all know, I work on women's poetry in Africa. So I'm very excited about reading Bussia's collection in this work, a very incisive reading. And in my perspective, the book does not only analyze the images of women in African poetry, but also brings the work of an African female poet into the conversation on poetry and exile. So the chapter on Bussia's notable collection, Testimony of Exile, published in 1990, approaches exile from a post-colonial feminist perspective. In my view, the book's main achievement is in its interdisciplinary engagement with African poetic discourse, situating exile in post-colonial, post-modernist, or perhaps modernist and feminist theories, of course, in relation to cultural studies and very dense reading of history. Oripeloye's book presents a compelling intersectional analysis of race, gender, class, nation, and culture in the poetic conceptualization of exile. The book brilliantly grounds the contemporary experience of exile in the crisis of colonial modernity. And that is where I find the decolonial edge of the work by, of course, linking exile to the experience of slavery and slave trade, and of course, colonialism and other forms of colonialities, in quotes. If this interdisciplinary engagement brings new insight to the discourse of African poetry, it also limits the potential of the work to offer a formal analysis of how the writers use poetic language to reconstruct the idea, concept, and social experience of exile. I find it intriguing that the book expands the possibility of reading poetry through the generic codes of fiction. In the book, we learn about the autobiographical mode in Chinekoka's poetry, the testimony mode in Bussia's poetry, the documentary mode in Ojuade's poetry, travel narratives in Ojaide's and Ofenon's poetry. Whereas this mode of reading deconstructs the binary or the boundary of literary genre and illuminates the palimpsestic formation of the poetic text, it risks reading poetry as a fictional narrative. And of course, there's a huge debate about how to read poetry itself as poetry. For example, Jonathan Coller's theory of the lyric is an example. And in my mind, this book sort of performs what neo-critics will call the heresy of paraphrase. This critical move leaves open the significant question: what specifically does poetic language bring to the literary imagination of exile in African discourse? And this question, you don't have to address it, it's just my own thinking. And I'm thinking here, if estrangement, a repeated concept in the book, constitute exile as a social phenomenon, and it is interesting that estrangement is also the name of the formalist strategy, of course, defamiliarization, for articulating the distinctive quality of poetic language. How then does it operate at the level of poetic form? In other words, how can we think of the formal estrangement effects of poetic language in the reconstruction of exile as a socially estranging phenomenon? So I'm trying to think about what can we gain from thinking about estrangement or defamiliarization as a form, and thinking about the estrangement capabilities of exile as a social phenomenon. So how do we read the calibration of exile as social estrangement and the poetic form, as an estranging device? Finally, the book promises to map a paradigm shift in the discourse of exile from the conventional to the cosmopolitan mode. In the conclusion of the book, Oripeloye clearly explains, and I quote, "There is a movement from the alienation associated with the conventional exile to contemporary cosmopolitan imaginary that seeks a reconfiguration of word spaces in terms of cultural affiliations." And here I would say that I'm not entirely sure of the transition from alienation to cosmopolitanism in the conceptualization of exile in the book. Indeed, for me, the book appears to hold both poetic configurations of exile together in ways that challenge the monolithic reading of exile. Perhaps then I should put it to the author if you might help us to think through this question. does cosmopolitanism necessarily suspend the experience of alienation? I'm just going to conclude by affirming that the book makes a remarkable argument about how African poets push the boundaries of exilic discourse in post-colonial studies to express the pain, anguish, trauma, and celebration, or perhaps in the word of George Lamin, pleasures of exile, while foregrounding how exile provide a creative sensibility for the cultivation of poetic knowledge on personal and social life. In this sense, the book is an invitation into the multiple worlds of exile in the African poetic discourse. And this critical invitation for me precisely is the strength of Poetics of Exile. Thank you so much for giving us this beautiful gift.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bangoshe. So we'll move to Razak. Razak Malik is a graduate of the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. He's a co-founder of Atelewo, the first digital journal devoted to publishing work written in the Yoruba language. He's the author of the poetry chapbooks, Home in This Land, selected for chapbook books edited by Kwame Dawes and Chris Abani. And he's also the author of The Other Names of Grief, published by Konya Shamsfrumi. Razak, welcome to our discussion today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. I'll start by and also thanking other panelists for the book 5 Anglophone West African Poet by Oripeloye. So I'll start now. So this is my reflection on the book. And so I started with an epigraph. To be in exile, according to William Grass, is not to be flung out of any door, but of your own door. It is to lose emotional belonging and ignore roots of one's daily entity, quoted in Northern 69, and that's on page 3 in the book. Henri Oripeloye's Poetics of Exile is an important book to exilic discourse in Anglophone West African poetry. It is a book that blazes with insightful ideas and thoughts about exile, migration, diaspora, and home, engaging 5 Anglophone West African poets, Shelen Koka, Abena Busia, Femi Ojoade, Odiao Femo, and Fenro Jaide. Oripeloye guides the reader through instances of exile in the poetry of this poet. He introduces us to first the instances of exile and migration in history. For example, the reference to the biblical allusion of the exit of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and the migration of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, Hijrah. Both examples situate migration and exile in the sense that one, Muhammad and his companions left Mecca due to heavy persecution from non-believers. The exit of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden was against their will. In Henri's book, history is rooted in the engaging exploration of exile and migration. Aside the just instance mentioned, the concept of migratory
Okay, Razak, we can't hear you at all.
languages invasion of communities of implication by black Supreme Court.
Can you hear me? We can't hear you at all.
I can hear you.
Okay. Maybe maybe that would work. Let's try that and see.
Okay. So what about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, I think it's better now.
Better now. Okay, can I start from the beginning? Like, can I repeat myself?
No, you don't have to start from the beginning. Just keep it from, from, I think we heard, for the most part what you already read.
Okay, thank you. So addressing the traumatic event of slavery on Africans, Oripeloye recounts the tragedies of homelessness, nostalgia, longing, and dislocation experienced by Black slaves. Slaves taken from Africa were transported across the sea to the new land. The Middle Passage becomes symbolic, a grim portal to the agony of slavery. The mention of ex-slaves like Frederick Douglass, Phillis Wheatley, Aloda Okwado, and others is a testament to the dark period of slavery and the displacement and dislocation of Black slaves that worked on plantation fields during slavery. For someone like Whitley, she was lucky to have been allowed to read and write. Many met terrible confrontation from their masters. Oripeloye quotes, "Literature of exile in the African continent started with slavery experience of the people. Therefore, the beginning of exile in Africa could be traced to the twin evil of slavery and slave trade. During this period, many Africans were headed away to the West, and these slaves went away with some residues of their culture and their new abode. This becomes a foundation for the enactment of the home cultures. Thus, the slave trade has remained by far the most important factor which dispersed African peoples and their culture all over the globe." It is fascinating to note that Oripeloye's deployment of post-colonial and postmodernist theories in mapping exilic tendency or narratives in the works of these poets offers us an extensive understanding of not only the book, but also the poems treated in the book. The post-colonial straddles the colonial, and thus the continuity is captured through the post-colonial reflections on the issues of exile, migration, and diaspora as engaged in the book. The post-colonial exile poet tackles and combats the fractured remains of homeland. The post-colonial exile poet carries the burden of homeland. The post-colonial exile poet interrogates and confronts the political quagmire, economic resets, cultural declination, and other problems at home. While facing the loss of mother tongue, as seen in one of Abena Busia's poems, the poet also battles with displacement, estrangement, ruthlessness. The post-colonial exile poet suffers the pain of racial discrimination, colorism, etc. Discussing estrangement from Africa, Oripeloye writes, Africa has reappearance of exile among African writers. As scholars in exile, the awareness of their extreme condition is brought to the light by Western societies impossible, and they live on the fringes of periphery of the society. Africa is central to the understanding of exilic oppressor in the culture, economy. This problem of slavery colonial periods confronted through decades of cultural displacement, economic death, and more political status of this homeland. Travels, gangs, displeasures, and rage
Okay, I think we lost Razak, so maybe we'll go to Jumoke Verissimo to give our presentation. Jumoke Verissimo is a Nigerian poet and writer. She's the author of 3 books, I Am Memory, The Birth of Illusion, and A Small Silence. Welcome to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Bogi. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Oripeloye. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, my fellow panelists. Dr. Ayaduba, it's good to see you again. Dr. Bangboshe, it's good to have that roll off my tongue. Congratulations. Dr. Soasesman, thank you so much. It's good to have you here as well. And so, like my panelists have mentioned, it's good to see a book on poetry, dedicated to poetry, and critical analysis of poetry on Anglophone poets. In my reading of Henri Oripeloye's Poetics of Exile, Henri Oripeloye's Poetics of Exile excavates the role of exile in its many manifestations, revisiting loss, absence, and dislocation in the works of 5 Anglophone West African poets, Seyi Cheshne Coker, Abena Busia, Odia Ofemo, Tanure Ojaide, and Femi Ojuade. While these poets share the same continental space, Oripeloye's work draws attention to their diverse experiences and the imminent effect on their form and the way it shapes their themes and forms of references and referencing, either to the self or acknowledgement of a perceived group experience. The argument in the book appears to be, the argument that Oripeloye appears to be making is that this author's interrogation of exile moves away from the trope of, as it writes, nostalgia, alienation, rootlessness, and restlessness. He explains that exile in the works of these Anglophone poets operate as a self-examination for the poets and their various socio-political machinations of nationhood. Primarily, one gets a sense that Oripeloye's book wants to move beyond the trope of the fleeing, disconcerted, disconnected, disjointed narratives that deny the poet as a product of a past that can become a source for understanding a new phenomenon like exile. Exile in this work is a site of revelations and at times reinvention. In the first 3 chapters of the book, Beginning and Continuities, Exile, Exploration of Auxiliary Discourses, and Exile, the Place of Cultural Mediation, Oripeloye establishes the link between migration and exile, the influence of colonial and post-colonial discourses, and the ways in which culture structures the expression of absence and loss in this poetry, in the works of the 5 poets. In the chapter Beginning and Continuities, Oripeloye's assertion of the connection between migration and exile, particularly as a motif in literary history, comes from the trope of loss. The loss encountered of the home results in a wandering. Wonder, as therefore established in the book, is a primary nature of man, right from the beginning. The beginning here is derived from the biblical religious narratives, both the beginning here is derived from the biblical narratives of expulsion from the Garden of Eve and Islam's representation of the Prophet Muhammad's flight for safety. The idea of the restless nature of man, which accounts for his perpetual need to wander, is also buttressed through the Yoruba philosophy of the world as a marketplace. It goes on to describe the other forms of historical dispassions that have led to movement from home, emphasizing the pain of nostalgia and loss. The author evaluates the different way in which exile is considered as a form of punishment, also from as a right anti-establishment renegade, or a connection with the diasporic. While the chapter begins with a comparison that links migration to exile, Oripeloye's distinction of what distinguishes one from the other is not very prominent to the reader. The author, however, makes a point to establish the incursion of Anglophone poets into the exilic poetry tradition as a result of writing in the language of colonizers. The point made hence is that Faced with a new language, the imagination explored their imagination explored the evolving environment to locate themselves in their new spaces. The author identifies slavery, colonialism, war, natural disasters as conditions that result in exile, to which the poets respond. In chapters 2 and 3, the author asserts that contemporary exilic poetry is a product of the colonial experience as well as literary theories. These theories, post-colonial and postmodernism, are considered by the poet as factors for expressing the complexities of alienation and displacement. The feeling of alienation and displacement that is expressed is, however, not simply about the ongoing reality, but also the forms of marginalization that colonialism made poets absent, that made the poets absent from their homes before their exiles commenced. Citing work from Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Omi Baba, the idea of the interaction of two cultures is explored to mean what would emerge, is explored as what would mean to emerge into a new form of poetry. By extension, the new form here is presented as a cultural mediation, a connection of two worlds, the poet's past and their ongoing reality. The past, which is the culture that is embodied in the idea of the nation left behind, and the traces of what can become forms of renewal for exiles to reconstruct a new identity. The rest of the book focuses on analysis of the specific work of each of the 5 poets and the themes that reoccur in their writing. This establishes his argument of the diversity of experiences that exile provides. In this regard, Oripeloye examines the various historical, social, and cultural contexts of each poet. Sheisheshni Koker's writing, for example, is informed by his personal experience, memory, and community. These 3 themes or concepts, which Oripeloye argues are prevalent in the poet's work, citing from his collection, Concerto for Exile, are responses to the shaping of his nation's identity around the transatlantic slavery and its history of returnees, as well as neo-colonial discourses. In his examination of Abenas Boussier's work, Testimonies for Exile, the author pursues feminist inclinations that journey as a tool for journeying into the past. Similar to Cheshni Koker, our writing explores memory, or more precisely, a nostalgia that becomes a testimony for our condition as an exile. While I celebrate our inclusion in the book, I would have loved to see a more balanced inclusion, perhaps 2 female poets. In the chapter on Odia Ofemo and Tanuri Ojaide, it's more of an exploration of identity in the cosmopolitan. Ofemo's writing, particularly as an exile, is situated mostly as an experience of his travel, in which his identity is constantly being negotiated. Tanuri, however, focuses on how culture is transmitted between spaces. The 2 poets, Oripeloye seems to argue, continue their works as activists and purveyor of culture. For me, this is the weak link in the book. I think there was too much focus on the travel writing. And the most significant analysis for me, however, in the book is a chapter on Femi Ojo-Ade's writing. The book, this work, unlike the others, the chapter, unlike the other, attempts to reimagine the idea of exile as he imagines it from the home front. It explores the initial dissociation that can create a need for wandering, which was established in the beginning chapters. Generally, my own idea of the book is that there is a conflation of terminologies between travel writing, migration, and exile. And perhaps a need for a periodization that helps understanding what the author means by the term contemporary. In conclusion, Oripeloye makes an argument for the poetics of exile among Anglophone poets and the reinterpretation of exile in their works and their poetry forms. This is certainly a good contribution to scholars of exilic literature. And yeah, I guess that's about it. So generally, like I said, I think one of the things that I feel is that I think there's a conflation in the terminology especially between travel writing. The book began with discussions on migration and exile. So I was expecting that at some point the author would, develop where exile deviates from the term migration. Of course, when we migrate to be in exile is to migrate, but then there is a specificity here where exile is being talked about. And I would have loved to see how the authors, especially as he argues that exile should be used in the analysis of those poems, I would have loved a more elaborate discussion on exile as exile, but not exile conflicting with the idea of migration and then travel writing, especially when the author is talking about Oripeloye's writing, which seems to be like an afterthought to generate generate material for discussion in connection with the theory of post-colonialism. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book because, like I said, it's really very good. It's very good to have a new work that focuses on poetry and not novel all the time. It's novel all the time. So thank you, Professor Oripeloye, for this work.
Thank you very, 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 very much. And I completely agree that, sorry, Arthur, we need to have more books on African poetry. Definitely then, because all the books are actually novels, so I'm always like, where are the poetry books, they should come out. But anyway, the next person I am inviting is writing a book, an exciting book on African poetry. And this is Dr. Nathan Sosima. Dr. Nathan Sosima is an associate professor of English and a core faculty member of the Institute of African Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He also serves as the book and media review editor of the Journal of the African Literature Association, the author of the book, Poetry, Print, and the Making of Post-Colonial Literature, published in 2017 by Cambridge University Press. He's now working on a book about 21st century African poetry. Welcome to our discussion today.
Thanks so much. I'm really grateful to Dr. Bogi for the invitation to join this company of brilliant writers and scholars. I'm grateful to our author, to Prof. Oripeloye, for this book. And I also see his publisher, Steve Shaba, among the attendees. So thank you for publishing this work. I have a few images kind of to try to keep me on track if the host doesn't mind enabling screen sharing. It looks like it's disabled at the moment. And as far as I know, this is the only book-length study devoted to multiple African poets in English since Ege's Nation, Power, and Dissidence in third-generation Nigerian poetry in English, which was back in 2014.
I think it's enabled already, right?
Yes, thank you. Y'all see that okay? Brilliant cover. And I'm eagerly awaiting some other books soon, including from members of this panel. The author examines poetry collections from the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and we've already heard their names. I noticed, interestingly, that if we arrange them chronologically from Syl Cheney Coker's through Odio Ofemun's, published in 1980 and 2000, we also move from being published in London to Lagos. And I'll have something more to say about that at the end. And by writing this book, Prof. Oripeloye has not only helped to crystallize our understanding of late 20th century African poetry, but also laid a foundation for further work on 21st century poetics. As the author and my fellow panelists have noted, exile has been with us for as long as humans have preserved narratives. As far back, perhaps, as the Garden of Eden, the exile of the people of Israel and Babylon, and the the hijra or emigration of the prophet. The author finds exile at the start of modern West African poetry too. Quote, Okibo and Clark perceive themselves as exiles from a primal tradition, unquote. Colonialism is the culprit here, affecting a kind of existential exile, even for poets who are not forced to migrate physically. Or as the author later writes, quote, the main thrust of Cheney Coker's exposition in Concerto for an Exile is the experience of colonialism as an exile, unquote. So the term exile shifts shape throughout the book. And maybe at this point, it'd be helpful to see a table of contents. There we go. Sorry, it's being there, full tricky. So by the time we reach chapter 7 on the late Femi Ojoade's collection, Exile at Home, published in 1998, the focus is on internal exile. And the author's definition of exile in terms of political and cultural alienation from a nation or community extends here to alienation from the Nigerian state under Abacha, including the predicament of the Ogoni people and others in the Niger Delta. And I think it's becoming clear that a lot of us found that chapter very compelling. I'm persuaded by the author that exile, especially in poetry, is indeed a protean experience. Back in chapter 2, the author makes the post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha and the concept of hybridity key points of reference for the study. This chapter opens with a memorable claim, quote, exilic poetry resists cultural imperialism, but identifies with forms of newness that came with colonialism. As he explores further in chapter 3, the term exile is akin to another migrant or wandering concept, that of diaspora. It is the lot of the diasporic subject to be, quote, living in one place and thinking or dreaming of another place. And the exile too is presumably living in one place and thinking or dreaming of another place. Here, like Jumake, I wouldn't have minded a clearer distinction between these concepts. Maybe we can say that while exile focalizes the individual, diaspora is always about an imagined community. As someone who grew up in Western Canada and now lives in the Southeast United States, nearly 4,000 kilometers from my hometown, I wouldn't consider myself an exile by any means. Could I consider myself part of a Canadian diaspora? Or would claiming the term diaspora minimize the oppression faced by racialized diasporas? One place to turn would be to a classic essay by the Jamaican British sociologist Stuart Hall, entitled Cultural Identity and Diaspora. And Prof. Oripeloye offers Hall's first definition of cultural identity, the top one here. He quotes, the first position defines cultural identity in terms of one shared culture, a sort of collective one true self, hiding inside the many other more superficial or artificially imposed selves, which people with a shared history and ancestry hold in common. This model of identity pre-exists representation. But Hall also offers, indeed, I think advocates for an alternate definition, which is worth quoting at length. This second position recognizes that as well as the many points of similarity, there are also critical points of deep and significant difference, which constitute what we really are, or rather, since history has intervened, what we have become. Cultural identity in this second sense is a matter of becoming as well as of being. It belongs to the future as much to the past. It is not something which already exists, transcending place, time, history, and culture. In the second model, diasporic identity is discovered in the process of being represented. Since the book draws on postmodern thinking elsewhere, I was curious why it rests with the first, more essentialist definition rather than the second, more constructivist one. Is this latter definition of an identity that belongs to the future less applicable to poetry of the 1980s and 1990s, perhaps, than to poets writing in the 2010s and 2020s? As the book moves from the more theoretical chapters to those centering on specific poets, I appreciated the author's attention to the complexity of first-person narration in poems. What he terms the autobiographical mode with regard to Sol Chaney Coker, the testimonial mode with regard to Abena Busia, is never simply a record of an individual. And to my mind, it would be possible to highlight that complexity even more in our readings of individual poems. For example, the author reads Busia's delightful short poem entitled, "In Any Way, I Can't Go Home," as evidence of the debilitating effect of exile on artistic construction. Yet there's a fundamental paradox here, because what the poem speaker says, that she doubts she'll write a poem about being a long way from home, is at odds with what the author has actually done, which is to write a poem. And a couple pages later, Busia's poem Migrations is dedicated for Homie because I changed his words. The poem's refrain is a litany of words: immigrant, migrant, emigrant, exile. And so we find an instance of the poet preempting the critic by engaging playfully with Homie Baba, while drawing attention to the status of the poem, not just as the expression of an individual, but as part of a textual web. I think we come closest to Lagos in chapter 6 on Odio Ofemun and Tenuri Ojaide's poetry, specifically as Ofemun observes parallels between Lagos and New York, Lagos and London. Of Ofemun and Ojaide, the author writes, quote, "Readers encounter a touch of double consciousness in this poetry, as the poets encourage an acceptance of cosmopolitan cultures, while at the same time advocating for the survival of local identity markers." And this assessment reminded me of something that the Kenyan scholar Evan Wangi has written about the Ugandan poet Susan Nchibuli and her contemporaries. This is the second quote here. "Double consciousness and hybridity are not a submission to the dominant culture. They are a means by which East Africans negotiate differences from colonial cultures and sometimes equally suffocating pre-colonial practices. It seems no stretch to say that West Africans too are not submitting to, but negotiating with what the author earlier called forms of newness." In my own research, I often find myself writing about writers' creative negotiations with cultural institutions like publishers. And so we can think of Heinemann, that publishes Sol Chaney Coker's collection, or Hornbill, which is Ofemun's own kind of imprint for his work. Tracking the collections in the order that the author treats them, I note that their places of publication shift from London for Chaney Coker, Trenton, New Jersey for Busia, to Lagos, Calabar, and Ibadan for Ofemun, Ojaide, and Ojoade, respectively. It would be a mistake to judge a book by its place of publication, just as much to judge it by its cover. But even so, might the fact that thematically exilic poetry is actually being published in Nigeria suggest that these poets are not exiled from the means of literary production? I'd be very curious to hear more from the author about how he thinks about the publics for these poets and their negotiations with the means or the institutions of literary production. And congratulations again on this beautiful book. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I think we have, I don't know whether Razak is able to give his final presentation in 5 minutes, so that I'd love to have 25 minutes. Dr. Oripeloye can reply, can respond maybe in 10 minutes, and then we can take Q&A. But 5 minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir. So, so I'll be looking at the poets engaged in this book by Henri Oripeloye. And so, aside engaging colonialism and exile in the collection, Abena also examines feminist issues in her poems. However, Oripeloye's postmodernist intervention in the book, I think, lessens the burdens of exile as cultural cross-pollination becomes inevitable. Through postmodernism, the poet becomes unrestricted and formless, dynamic in the appreciation of cultures and homeland. Odiaofemu and Tanuri Ojaide's poetry, unlike the poetry of Shenekok and Abena, does not produce untin exilic events. The postmodernist element in the poems offers us a chance to indexes. Their cultural affiliations are not confined or pigeonholed. Through travels, Odia recounts in his poems the similitude that exists between places he traveled to and Nigeria. Tanuri Ojaide's poetry has been colored by his stay abroad. His cultural consciousness is not restricted to his homeland alone. Ofemu's London Letter and other poems and Tanuri Ojaide's When It No Longer Has Where You Live can be said to carry the toga of globalization or cultural ability. The global world is spacious enough to occupy everyone, and the poet feed at home is everywhere, reiterating Spivak and Rushdie's claim about the deconstruction of home. This is different from Osundare's comparison of Ajegunle Makoko in his collection titled Nusong. The negative consciousness comes to the fore. Lepa Senghor's celebration of two cultures, French and African cultures, also is evident in Ofemu's and Tanuri Ojaide's poems. The images suggesting the confluence of these two cultures are seen in the poems. Like Tanuri and Ojaide, they are a child of two or multiple worlds. Ojoade's exile at home internalizes exile and shows the possibility of exile in one's homeland. The post-colonial angst is refilled in the poems as the poet laments and rages against African leaders. For example, the brutal regime of Babangida and Abacha are examined. In contemporary Nigerian literature, poets such as Romeo Oriogun, Adiabagbenga, and others are writing about migration and exile. Born and bred in Nigeria, this poet, through poetry, engages both push and pull factors at home, and also their personal lives and how living abroad contribute to it. Adiabagbenga, Exodus, and Salawu Olajide's Preface for Living Homeland are critical examples of exilic narratives in the contemporary Nigerian literary space. Letter Home and Biafra Night by Afam Ake is also a brilliant addition to this discourse. Ologui-based poem about exile, Odiaofemu, The Poet Lied, and Jumoke Fadisimo's Memory are also brilliant collections that engage the problems at home. Yeah, and Yaku James, Where the Medical is another important addition. In all, Henri's book is an important book that addresses the issue of exile, diaspora, migration, and how these poets engage these tropes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oga Razak. I'm glad that at least you were able to give your presentation. Thank you very much. Again, thank you, Dr. Oripeloye, for giving us this book, and thank you, my publisher, my boss, my editor, for producing the book. It's really great to see you here. And of course, I don't know, but a little bit of history. So I think these kinds of discussions were the things that actually introduced me formally to poetry. I trained under Professor Oripeloye as an undergraduate, so was my mentor, and that was how I got introduced and hooked on poetry, as a matter of fact. So it's good to see this book in print and to see you here. And after many, many years, seeing us talking about poetry at another level. I would invite him to respond, but I would quickly read a little bit about him before he responds. Dr. Oripeloye is a senior lecturer in the Department of English at Obafemi Awolowo University, Ife. His research interests are modern African poetry, cultural studies, and life writing. He was a lecturer at Adekunle Ajasin University, Akungba Akoko, Ondo State between 2004 and 2011. He was a visiting adjunct lecturer in the Department of English, Lizade University, Lara Mokin. He has reviewed articles for journals, including journals, Contemporary African Studies, Advances in Literary Studies, among others. He has published in journals such as Neolicom, Marang, Matatu, Obsidian, Tiscrive, Journal of Musical Arts, African Notes, Advances in Literary Studies, and many other journals. He's a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, And of course, has published books such as Reading Literature, and this one which we're actually discussing today, which is Poetics of Exile. Welcome, Dr. Oripeloye, to our conversation. So I would just invite him to respond. I think if you can do it in 10 minutes so that we can take other people's questions, have a robust discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Tosin, for being the chair of this panel. I know you are a co-conspirator in the production of this book. I could remember you typed some of the chapters while we were together at Kumba. So thank you so much. I want to thank the LSA for finding this book interesting to be part of the discussion in the conference of this nature. Then the discussions too, I'm so grateful for your incisive comments on the book. Well, as a work in progress, as I can call it, because we continue to talk about it, even if you are not rewriting. The mere fact that we are talking about it means that it's a work in progress. So I have really gained a lot from what has been said by the discussants. Well, significantly, we'll be able to look at what exile represents in African poetry, which hitherto has not really been discussed. We heard about it, but there has not been any real attempt to look at it this way we have done. And thank God for your expressing that idea that, well, it can be part of what we can keep in our shelf as a book. I appreciate that comment. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, there's something I will say really, except to thank people for their comments. But significantly, my brother Arthur, yes, made some comments and possibly trying to see how we can connect the experience of Okonko as an exile. And then he mentioned the idea of the Yoruba market. In Yoruba cosmology, the market is a kind of materialist identity. It's a place where you go and then you come back. Just like people will say, let me go to the farm and come back. It's not the idea of the market that you go to sell things. They believe that when you go there to sell things, you cultivate some kind of a relationship with it, but eventually the market will close. And then everybody will leave. It's like there's no longer another market. That is kind of thing that you will look at as a market that, well, it's a place where you go and then you depart. It's like moving away from Earth to another planet, wherever it is, either heaven or hell, I don't know. So that is the concept of the Yoruba people about that. Then we also look at the Okonko matter. Fine. Exile in whatever form is a way of learning. It's a way of gaining new insight. By the time Okonko went to his mother's place, and then looking back at Umofia, he will learn some lesson. The mistakes he made while he was in Umofia will be a conscious effort in his mind that, look, I've made this, next time I won't do such a thing again. But eventually, we discovered that he went back and committed more crime. He did more by even killing himself, because that's to us, it cannot be a kind of a way of fighting evil. Killing yourself should not be a way. You should be able to stand by it and then look at it in the face. So thank you so much for your insight, Ayanduba. Then moving to Bamigboche, yes. Your calibration of exile, social estrangement, all those kind of things. Well, I also believe in all those things that you said. Then the idea of form, how do we use language to differentiate what exile is in the present moment? Well, we should know that there's a kind of instability when it comes to the use of language. We can't really pigeonhole it in terms of form. So there's that kind of fragmentation and movement. As we continue to discover, our consciousness also reflects whatever is the position of things that we come across. And from there, we are able to reflect this in the form or the language that we use. And about exile, there's always a movement. And then the consciousness of those people that we refer to as exilic personalities will reflect what they go through in their respective positions or places. So thank you too for this. Then you ask a question that whether cosmocentrism can heal or can say, you ask whether cosmocentrism can suspend the experience of exile. It can never do that. It can only mitigate it. They can assuage. They can never forget themselves as an exilic personality because it's always ingrained in the consciousness. Even if you forget where you come from, somebody will remind you where you come from one day or the other. Even your environment will remind you. So it can only assuage, it cannot help make anybody to forget the experience of exile. Thank you. Yes. Jumoke, thank you so much for your contributions too. I listened to you carefully. Yes, there's a mix-up about exile, migration, and travel writing. Well, this time, they are so close that you can see somebody in exile could become a diasporic personality as he joins the group of people in a way that he'll say, oh, these are people from my community, and then he becomes. So there's that kind of connection. One leads to the other. That we cannot have somebody in the diaspora is also in exile, but that communal effort, communal relationship is what that's what brought them together as people in exile. Then after thoughts, post-colonial thoughts about Femi and Ojaide, I want to say significantly that these two poets, for me, they qualify to be regarded as exile poets in what they have done. I'm not looking at their personality. For instance, I mentioned there that Ojaide lives in Nigeria. He travels here and there. And through that, he got some kind of experiences that he could put in London Letter and other poems. So if you are saying that's a kind of an afterthought, we are moving, the idea we have in the book is a kind of movement. That's what we call conventional exilic experience. When people are pushed away from their homeland, either by force or by their personal way of movement, one way or the other. For instance, those things could say, now that I'm in exile. There is an economic exile. It won't be forced out of anywhere. You can be in Nigeria tomorrow if he has the to fly, if he has the ticket to fly into Nigeria. So we refer to him as a kind of postmodernist. So that the stereotyping of exile is somebody that has been pushed away. So that's that kind of movement. So that is why I'm able to qualify Ojaide and Ofemo as Israeli writer. Yes, this thing applies to Dr. Susan in his discussion. Thank you for that analysis that you gave. Then the other collective exile in diaspora that you mentioned, fine to me, I can understand what you are saying, but let us know that the exilic narration or the exilic experiences that we have now, or we are looking at, there's that kind of movement that people experience exile somehow, and this other. So what I'm saying in essence is that we do not experience exile in the same way. There's always that kind of either individual touch or individual experiences that we connote how you are able to enjoy or complain about your exilic condition. So thank you so much for everything. I want to thank the panelists again. Start from Dr. Bami Goshe. Thank you. Yes, our friend that we couldn't hear very well, Malik. Thank you so much for that effort. Unfortunately, when it happens, people will say life happens. So we couldn't hear you, but towards the last, we were able to come up and tell us what you have discovered in the book. So significant the way you have presented this. So I thank you, Dr. Malik, Dr. Susan, then Ayaduba. Thank you so much. Then Dr. Bami Goshe and Dr. Resibo. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you so much.
Oh, all right, thank you very much. So we'll open it up for general discussion. I think we still actually have about 15 minutes, which is really good. In fact, we can actually say, oh, we're going to do a whole book on African poetry in this case. But I do have a question, which has to do with the demarcation between what you might describe as voluntary exile or forced, the division between forced or voluntary, exilic movements. So, for example, when you described me the other time, you said that my kind of exile is voluntary. So, but how do we differentiate between people who are like migrant workers displaced?
Let me give you an instance. When we talk about forced exile, the most recent we had was Eba Soyinka during the Abacha regime, who was accused of overthrowing the government, and he ran away from the country. At that particular time, he could not come back to Nigeria for his life. He has to protect his life. So that's the kind of forced exile. But you are talking about yourself, people that packed their bags and got a kind of a job, a better job, because we are talking about the greener pasture. When you left a place that is dry, like many of you will say, oh, Nigeria is not as green as where you are. So you left on your own, and you can come back as your own convenient time. So that is how I think I'm able to differentiate between voluntary and forced exile.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think I was just opening up for other people who might want to. I mean, I don't necessarily see myself as a voluntary exile. I see myself every time as a displaced, migrant. And displacement can be in so many forms, right? It can be, it can be, but that's basically how I like to think about it. And I remember that when this is not about the book, but anyway, I remember I had a conversation with Arthur once where I sent him a material, and I was talking about travel, and he said, well, but this figure doesn't look like a traveler. This figure looks like a wanderer. And that's something that I took away from that, from that conversation, because a lot of people do indeed think that a lot of us here, we are, and I know that a lot of people subscribe to that, which is the cosmopolitan, Afropolitan thing, but there's also a kind of violence that underwrites that movement in the very first instance, so that the whole cosmopolitan description might not really do a lot of justice to it. So, for example, I'm a professor in the US, so a lot of people would think, therefore, I'm very cosmopolitan. But in the real sense of it, it's that there's a certain level of violence in the very first instance that brought me into this place that then continues to perpetually, suspend, that reality of either being an American or identify as an American, which is a very difficult thing to do, and different kinds of stuff. So I wanted to complicate that a little bit so that we can maybe there are people who want to jump in and talk about it.
Okay, thank you. Let's listen to other people, please.
Well, for me, and I think this also goes back to a question Nathan and Jumoke raised, and I think Steve, probably Steve, Steve Shaba, I think he's left now. He also put something like that in the chat about exile and migration. For me, just bouncing off from what Tosin said, it's to understand the bigger imperialist system that circulates populations, the different ways in which people are circulated, and whether the concept of exile actually captures these circulations of populations and movements and so on. To some extent, I don't necessarily think exile captures that, at least in the way that we discuss exile. Cosmopolitanism seems to even distract attention more from the colonial system enforcing these kinds of things. But to the question about migration and exile, I know I had this argument with Professor Oripeloye in 2013 when I left Nigeria, and we had those email exchanges where he said, well, you are one of these exiles, you fled. I said, no, I'm not an exile. I'm not fleeing. Yeah, but I understand that and where that is coming from. But I think what I'm quarreling with is, and I'm not trying to bring Okonkwo again because we are dealing with poetry, so let's stay with poetry. But what I'm quarreling with here is the idea of reading our realities within this framework of exile constantly that doesn't necessarily account for other ways in which identities and what they call subjectivity are shaped and informed by some other context, right? Yeah, so it's that, but migration is not necessarily exile. And I think Nathan raised an important question when he cited his own experience of moving from his hometown in Canada to eastern part of the US. Is that a form of exile? Is that, so in a sense, we reserve migration for certain kinds of people and exile for some other kinds of people when they move. And I thought there has to be another way to theorize and account for the nuances and complexities of those movements.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Is anybody else? Okay, I was going to say, yeah, that I agree with Arthur regarding that sense of perhaps creating new concepts if there is a need to do that, because there's always that sense of wisdom. I mean, like you and Tosin, I wouldn't also consider myself an exile. So there's always that sense of trying to always define, so what am I, especially when using the analysis in Ojuade's work of that forced alienation, even before you left the country, and coming here, the alienation has always been there, but it's not an alienation that is defined by forced expulsion. It was voluntary, but at the same time, it isn't an exile, even though there were conditions that pushed you out of the place. And so it's perhaps if there is a possibility of writing another book, it would be like just to continue this discussion, or anybody else could continue with that, but it would be good to see how this moves forward, to see the new forms of migration, and if we can have new names for it, for this phenomenon we can't find a name for yet. We know that we are not exiles. We know that we have conditions that that may not make us return at this time, but we are free to go in and out. But at the same time, we would want to have a name for it. I guess I'm leaving Professor Oripeloye to decide if he wants to go on and write.
I give you a name. I give you a name. Thank you so much. Yeah. Well,
all right.
Tosin.
Yes, sir. So we have 2 more questions because we're about time. Okay. So if you can take them very, very quickly. The first one is from Dr. Kusuma, and I will be curious to hear from Dr. Oripeloye about his selection of texts. Were there other collections that you considered for inclusion, but decided again, like maybe you removed other texts, or what kinds of selections did you have and how?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I was, well, during the selection of texts, I had a very large kind of template that I would have loved to work with. For instance, Before the Palm Could Bloom by Patricia Wesley from Liberia. It was one of the materials I put forward. But as I looked through, I discovered that it was more of a war narration. and just very minute aspect of it that they cannot go as a whole chapter for a Zilic discussion. Then I also look at Larry Peters, which would have been the first, I think, Song of Exile. That should have been the first poetry of exile from Africa. But unfortunately, if it wasn't available, I tried to get the copy, I couldn't, and like others. So I had that kind of idea of selecting more text. Thank you. Then about name, well, I don't know. In some places you pay when you do some kind of naming. Tosin was close to it when he said that he is a kind of, he can try as a wanderer. Then you can qualify it as a wanderer because it's by choice that you decide to wander around the world. Thank you.
Oh dear, that's a good one. Oh no, that's a good one. So this is from Dr. Kemi Wale Olaito, and she's asking, my concern is that you did not extend your focus to an engagement of post-feminism or other feminine theoretical concepts in relation to the female exiles, especially when you engage in the post-colonial and post-modernist frameworks. Is this deliberate?
I read Busia from a feminist point of view, and I could remember talking about the problems faced by the women in terms of critical theories. I don't know what about post-feminist idea, but within that text, I cannot impose all theories on a particular text. I have to have my own choice, and then we the one that will give me a kind of focused reading or analysis of the text. That's what I've used. So there's that. If she looks at the text or the book, she will see that I've used a kind of feminist discourse to place Bernard Busia within a Zilic discourse. Thank you.
And just to add one thing, it might also be that maybe at the time, post-feminism hadn't become a big discourse as it is now, right?
Okay.
I think it's like a very big,
okay. Yeah, thank you so much.
But again, I want to thank everyone for creating time to be in this panel. I saw that people actually do things, which means that they actually spent a lot of time committing to it. I don't know, whatever magic happened that I had to be the one moderating rather than talking about poetry. This is something I enjoy, but this time around, I'm on this other side. But thank you very much. And this is a very powerful, super packed panels of, some of the most powerful writers in Nigeria and as well as academics. I am very glad and I'm thankful for everybody's time. Dr. Oripeloye?
Yeah, my last word, just to say thank you again for the engagement we've had. And again, I want to thank some co-conspirators who are also on this platform. Tosin, you are number one in terms of this book. For it coming to life, so you did a lot of things. Our publisher, Crafty, it's Kraft Books, but I used to call him Crafty Kraft. Then I have Aisha from Uganda, and then there's Moyi Dowu, and then Monde Oripeloye, my daughter. All of this, they were part of the conspirators in the production of this book. Thank you all, and then all other people that have been on the panel, making one suggestion or the other. And I hope, as I said earlier, it's always a work in progress, a discussion in progress, which I'm going to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Arthur.
It's good to see you, my Oga.
How are you doing now? How is Winnipeg?
We are surviving it from heat wave to cold. So.
Hey, you have to. That's the price to pay for being an exile.
No, we are not, not on exile. I think we prefer this climate to Buhari's climate. So.
Yeah, the climate of shooting. The climate of shooting. Now, one of my cousins, you see them in Winnipeg?
Yes, I do. Occasionally, I run into them. You know, they are these religious people. So we non-church goers, we rarely cross paths. But once in a while, when we attend weddings, we see them.
We'll see them. Well, that's part of the program we'll have. If you ask them, their father was the biggest masquerade in our village.
Can you believe that?
Yes. The biggest masquerade in our village was their father. These are the kind of things we need to discuss, and then about cultural interaction and then movement away from what you used to be to another thing. And it will always cause crisis for us. It will always cause crisis for us. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. Tosin.
Okay, good to see you. Good to see you, and thank you for this book.
Okay, so
thank you. So I think we have to go. They are going to cut us out.
Okay. Bye bye, everybody. We'll see you again. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.